Well, in this lesson for the Carabas Baptist Association pastors, I would like to talk about the subject of preaching the historical books of the Old Testament. We're talking about the books basically that are called in the historical section of the Old Testament: Joshua, Judges, Ruth, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. So today we turn our attention to how to preach the historical books of the Old Testament. In my opinion, some of the most fun preaching to do out of the Old Testament is in the historical books. These 12 books from Joshua all the way through Esther have fascinating stories in them, and it makes for some really good preaching. So I'm excited to be able to talk about that particular subject today, and I want us to just to walk through these to be able to cover as much as we can in the time frame that we have on how to go about preaching the historical books of the Old Testament. We begin with Joshua, and I want to do a brief outline for each of these 12 books as we go through, as well as maybe talk a little bit about resources that you can find or that will be helpful in preparation of sermons to preach through these books. Now, we're not going to look in detail in each of these books. We will not have the time for that. So we're going to just do a quick overview and maybe talk about a few key things that will help you in preaching. So, talk about the book of Joshua for a minute. It is the logical book that follows Deuteronomy and the Pentateuch, because in the book of Joshua, God leads his people through Joshua into the promised land. The book of Joshua is all about victory through faith. We trust in God, and God leads his people into the promised land. Now, the structure of the book of Joshua, and when you get ready to compose some sermons on the book, you need to realize the book really falls into three large sections. You have the entering the land in the first 5 chapters of Joshua. And then those 5 chapters each can be described as follows. Joshua receives his charge from the Lord in chapter 1. Joshua sends out the spies to Jericho in chapter 2. The Jordan River is crossed in chapter 3. The memorials are built after the crossing of the Jordan River in 4, and then Gilgal is occupied in chapter 5. Entering the land. And then we have overcoming the land, taking the land, so that in chapter 6 we have the fall of Jericho. And then in chapter 7, the sin of Achan. In chapter 8, the fall of Ai, the sack of the city of Ai. In chapter 9, the guile, the trickery of the Gibeonites. And in chapters 10 through 12, the routing of all of the foes and the victories in order to take over the land. And then in the third major section of Joshua, you have occupying the land, chapters 13 through 24. So in chapters 13 through 19, the land is divided up. And then the cities of refuge are identified in chapter 20. And then what is given to the Levites, their portion is given in 21. And then the altar of witness that is built in chapter 22. And then the book closes in chapters 23 and 24 with Joshua's farewell. Now that is something of an overarching view of what you have in the book of Joshua. Now, let me just give you one illustration as you preach through the pericopes that are here. Take a look at Joshua 5:13 through 6:27. How would you construct a sermon on the taking, for example, of Jericho? Well, the divisions that are there, I want you to look carefully. If you have a Bible in front of you, you can look at that. But here are the episodes or the divisions that you would use in preaching on the fall of Jericho. It begins in 5:13, and in 5:13 through 15, Joshua bows before God as the commander, and Joshua receives orders from the commander in chief. And then that's the introduction to the whole unit. And then really the first episode or the first scene is in Joshua 6, 1 through 5. Joshua's word about how Jericho will fall before God's word about how the city will fall as he tells Joshua. And then in 6 through 11, we have scene 2, and they are told we're going to walk around Jericho on day 1 7 times. We're going to circle the city, 6 through 11. And then episode 3, 6, 12 through 14, we're going to go around Jericho for days 2 through 6. We're going to do the very same thing. And then in episode number 4, 6:15 through 20, 7 circuits around Jericho, 7 trips around the city on day 7. And then episode number 5 is 6:20 through 21. The walls collapse and Jericho is destroyed. And then episode number 6, chapter 6, verses 22 through 25, Rahab and her family are spared. And then you have the conclusion, 6, 26, and 27, which is Joshua's imprecation and a statement about Joshua's reputation. Now, there is a unit of material. You need to preach that entire unit. Don't chop that up. That unit goes together. You would need to do at least one sermon on 5:13 through 6:27. And notice that you have an introduction and a conclusion, and then you have 6 scenes in there. And I would develop my sermon according to those 6 scenes that you find in the book of Joshua. Now, we could go through the whole book and do that for a lot of pericopes there. We don't have time to cover all of that, but just notice throughout the book of Joshua, God's sovereignty, God's power. God is with his people, leading them. Sometimes the people disobey, and there are consequences to that disobedience. But nevertheless, the book of Joshua is a tremendous book to preach from. Wonderful, wonderful lessons that come. Now, I do have a number of good resources from my book, Preaching Tools, that I would recommend that you use or look at when preaching the book of Joshua. Some of the commentaries here that I list that you would find very helpful. Examples would be Robert Chisholm's book, Interpreting the Historical Books, Grand Rapids, Kriegel, 2006. Chisholm taught at Dallas Theological Seminary. Very helpful work on preaching all of the historical books, including Joshua, but I'll mention him only here, though this book would be helpful with all of these historical books that we are talking about. And then, of course, you have David Howard's commentary on Joshua in the New American Commentary series, and then M.H. Woodstra's commentary on Joshua in the New International Commentary on the Old Testament. And then I've listed here some really good preacher commentaries. They're really devotional commentaries that are very homiletically oriented. Erwin Lutzer's book, Overcoming the Grasshopper Complex, 1991, great book for Joshua. F.B. Meyer's book, Choice Notes on Joshua through 2 Kings, is a Kriegel reprint. You might like A.W. Pink's Gleanings in Joshua. Very good devotional work, helpful, very good help to you. W. Graham Scroggy's book, The Land and the Rest, published in 1952. And don't miss Alan Redpath's Victorious Christian Living. Excellent devotional studies that will be very, very helpful in your writing of sermons on the book of Joshua. Okay, well, preaching Judges is where we go next. How do you preach the book of Judges? The name Judges and the book Judges covers roughly the first 350 years of Israel's history in the land of Canaan. Joshua is entering the land, but then Joshua dies, and we have the period of the Judges. This is a period of transition. It's the death of Moses and Joshua, and before the kings, before the monarchy, is the period known as the Judges. And so the book of Judges is a very fascinating book. Now, the interesting thing about the book of Judges that you want to remember is Judges is all about failure through compromise. The people of God failed to follow God. Over and over, you read a verse like this: "And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord." And then you have the major statement that defines the whole book of Judges: everyone did that which was right in their own eyes. So when you're preaching through Judges, what you find is a cyclical book. The book of Judges is arranged where the people of God would fall into apostasy. They would fall into idolatry, or they would turn from the Lord. And then God would send judgment on them from the surrounding nations. And then they would cry out to God, and God would send a deliverer, a judge. And then that judge would die. They would fall into apostasy again. And then God would judge them. And then they would cry out for a deliverer, and God would send another judge, another deliverer. And so this is really the overall structure of the book of Judges. Now, there's some wonderful biographical preaching on some of these judges that you can do when you are preaching through the 21 chapter book of Judges. But what you have really are 12 judges that are mentioned in the book. And really those 12 are divided up into major judges where more material is given on them, and then the minor judges. So that the major judges in the book are Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson. Those are the major judges. The minor judges are Shamgar, Tola, Jair, Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon. But not much is said, maybe just a few verses, sometimes only one verse for Shamgar. And, little else is said about the judges, but you want to understand the major judges and the minor judges. Now, let me just give you an example of preaching. How you're going to preach through the book of Judges. You want to look, again, at each one of the pericopes and how the story unfolds. And again, we're in a form of narrative historical discourse, so we want to develop our sermon according to the number of scenes that are in the story. Now, let's take the story of Ehud in chapter 3, verses 12 through 30. When you look at that in your Bible, there are 7 basic units in the Ehud story. There is Israel serves the Moabites and Eglon for 18 years due to their acts of evil, verses 12 through 14. Number 2, scene 2, God raises up Ehud as a deliverer, 15 and 16. Ehud presents the tribute to the obese king, verses 17 and 18. Then Ehud murders Eglon. Remember, he's a little bit overweight, and Ehud stabs him in the flesh, the belly flesh of Eglon, kind of just covers the knife and the handle and everything. That's 19 through 23. And then his lifeless corpse is discovered by the courtiers in 24 and 25. And then Ehud led Israel, engages the Moabites in victorious battle, 26 through 29. And then there's a summary conclusion statement in verse 30. Now, this is an example, a manageable unit that you can preach through. The story of Ehud is basically chapter 3, verses 12 through 30. You do an entire sermon on Ehud, and you would draw out, of course, what are the practical applications that would be there and so forth. You have to determine all of that. But again, that's an example of a section in Judges. Now, you can do the same, for example, for the Gideon narrative. The story of Gideon covers Judges chapters 6 through 8. Again, in that story, there are a number of scenes that develop, but you would want to preach an entire sermon. Now, you'll have to summarize the material and the scenes. You can't preach too long on each scene. There are 18 scenes from Judges chapter 6 to the end of 8, 18 scenes in the story of Gideon. And so you would just develop the sermon according to those scenes. And by the way, those scenes can be found very easily. Commentary should show you that. But the handbook on the historical books of the Bible by Victor Hamilton would be a very, very helpful resource in, by the way, preaching all of the books, these 12 historical books we're talking about. But he lays out these 18 scenes in a way that is very helpful for preaching, and not just for the book of Judges. He does a lot of this for all of these 12 historical books. It's a very helpful handbook on preaching. It's not technically a commentary, but don't miss the opportunity to learn from that book. So you can preach a series of sermons or a sermon on Gideon. 3 chapters, 6, 7, and 8 in the book. But you let the scenes develop the story. You got 18 scenes, and you just develop your sermon in narrative fashion, and then come in back in the application. I would not inject application personally along the way, although you could do that, but I would recommend holding off on that. Now, one more quick section is the story of Samson in the book of Judges. This also is several chapters, 13 through 16. Samson takes up a lot of material, a lot of section of the book, and you can preach the story of Samson in 7 scenes. It's one story, but there are 7 scenes. You have his birth announcement and his early experience in chapter 13. Then in chapter 14, he marries a Philistine woman against his parents' desire. You have the lion episode, the riddle episode, and all of that in chapter 14. Scene 3 is chapter 15, 1 through 8. And Samson, you remember, he discovers that his father-in-law gave his wife to another man, and he's mad about it. He takes the 300 foxes, attaches the incendiary devices to their tails, and lets them loose in the fields, and the burning and destroying of the crops. A fascinating section of the story. And then 15:9 through 20 is scene 4. The Philistines respond by raiding Judah. Yet again, the Spirit of God enables Samson to, with the jawbone of a donkey, to achieve great victory. Scene 5, chapter 16, 1 through 3. Samson sleeps with a harlot, tears the doors of the city gates off, and so forth. And then scene number 6 is the Delilah scene, where she successfully entices Samson to reveal the source of his strength. His hair is cut, his strength is gone, and God is gone from his life. And the Philistines capture him and blind him. And then comes scene 7, 16:23 through 31, while the Philistines are gloating in their temple over their god Dagon. Samson prays a second time. God responds to him by restoring his strength, and in vengeance he destroys all of the Philistines along with his own life. Now, so here's the point. That's the summary. Now, you've got to preach that as a unit, because all of that goes together. So this is a sermon, would be a sermon. Now, you could create individual sermons here, so that's up to you. But I'm pointing out that the whole story of Samson, if we're going to do one sermon on Samson, we've got to cover 4 chapters, 13 through 16. And there is a way to do that. So, preaching the book of Judges, tragic book though it is, it's an important book in the Bible. But then let's move to the book of Ruth. Little Ruth, what a great little book, 4 chapters, and such a great book to preach from. And so in the book of Ruth occurs during the period of the Judges. And really Ruth is divided up by the chapters. The divisions of Ruth are very good, the chapter divisions. So in chapter 1, what I would do if I were preaching through Ruth, I would do 4 sermons, or maybe one overall sermon that's summary, and then come back and do 4. So I would have a total, I'd do 1 sermon per chapter after my summary sermon, and I would have 5 sermons on the book of Ruth. So you remember chapter 1, Elimelech and his family journey to Moab. But he dies, the 2 boys die, and Naomi is left with daughter-in-laws, one of whom returns back, and Ruth yet goes with Naomi back to Bethlehem. And chapter 1 ends with isolation, barrenness, begins with famine, ends with barrenness, and ends with isolation. And Naomi says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, bitterness. And then chapter 2 is when Ruth meets Boaz gleaning in the field. Then comes chapter 3, Ruth meets Boaz on the threshing floor at night. The chapter 2 is a daytime event between Ruth and Boaz. Chapter 3, a nighttime event. And then chapter 4, we have the 12 men at the city gate, and you remember how Boaz declares for Ruth as a kinsman redeemer, and we have all of that beautiful story. Boaz marries Ruth and gives birth to Obed in verses 13 through 17 of chapter 4. Then we have a listing of the 10 generations, genealogy, that is, ending with David in verses 18 through 22. And so the book of Ruth begins in sorrow and famine, but it ends with plenty. It begins with barrenness, but it ends with fruitfulness. It begins with isolation, but it ends in community. And in fact, we see the ancestry of King David. So don't miss preaching the book of Ruth. Now, there are some really good resources for preaching Ruth. I want to just mention, I did not mention, by the way, some resources for preaching Judges, but there are some really good commentaries out there. Don't miss Ralph Dale Ralph Davis's work, Such a Great Salvation Exposition of the Book of Judges. Lots of good preaching there. Don't miss Leon Wood's book, Distressing Days of the Judges. That's also a good one. And don't miss F.B. Meyer's work on the Judges. By the way, anytime F.B. Meyer writes on any book of the Bible or characters, he's well known for characters of the Bible. Be sure and take a look at him. So, okay, I'm edging that in. I forgot to talk about that with Judges. Now, let's go to Ruth. There are very good expositional commentaries on Ruth. One is by Cyril Barber from back in 1983 called Ruth, an Expositional Commentary. Daniel Block's 2 works on Ruth, one in the New American Commentary Series, the other in the Zondervan Exegetical Commentary Series. Highly recommended. Robert Chisholm's commentary on both Judges and Ruth, very, very helpful and would be very good to use. And there are several others on the book of Ruth that can be mentioned, that are found, that would be very helpful to preachers. If you'd like to know more about those, again, check out Preaching Tools. Now, let's move to Samuel. What about 1st and 2nd Samuel? 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, these 6 historical books, sets of 2. Let's talk briefly about them. 1st Samuel, the book itself, is the transition from the theocracy, God being in charge of all of Israel, to the monarchy. The people want a king. God says, okay, I'm going to give you what you want. You'll regret it, but I'm going to give you what you want. So the first book of Samuel is divided among 3 key characters. This is what you need to know before you preach Samuel. 3 key characters: Samuel, Saul, and David. And these 3 characters dominate the 3 major sections of the book of 1 Samuel. You've got Samuel chapters 1 through 7. 1 Samuel 1 through 7 is a story of Samuel, his birth, his youth, his call, his times and activities, and his service. And then there's a summary. Then you come to Saul, the first of the kings. He is appointed as king. He is has a promising beginning, but his later folly and sin and his rejection by God. And then comes David, the anointed successor, and you see his anointing by Samuel in chapter 16, his service before Saul, which includes the David and Goliath episode in chapter 16, 14 through chapter 20, and then David's years running from Saul, chapters 21 through 30, and finally the book ends with the death of Saul. So this is 1 Samuel. So again, the book divides up in this way, around these three key events. And basically, what you have in the book of First Samuel is Samuel. Another way to look at the structure is Samuel and his relationship in his young life to Eli, chapters 1 through 7. Then Samuel and Saul, chapters 8 to 15, and then Saul and David after Samuel dies, chapters 16 through 31 is a good way to look at what you have in First Samuel. Now, let's talk about Second Samuel. Obviously, First Samuel includes material about the life of David, the early life of David, but it doesn't cover everything in the life of David. So actually, David's life is covered in First Samuel chapter 16 all the way to Second Samuel 10. And then you have David is also talked about in 2 Samuel 13 through 1 Kings chapter 2. Now, what's interesting is the early sections of 1 Samuel 16 to 2 Samuel 10, those sections are all talking about David's good things. But then when you get to 2 Samuel 13 all the way to 1 Kings 13, it shifts and you wind up looking at David's major sins. And so it becomes very, very interesting how those two relate to one another. Now, here is the outline of David's life in 2 Samuel. Chapter 1 is David as the loyalist to the former king. Chapters 2 through 4, David as the new king. Chapter 5, 1 through 25, David as the national king. Chapter 6, David and his relationship to the Ark of the Covenant. Chapter 7, David as head of his household. Chapter 8 through 10, David as a warrior winning victories. 11 and 12, David as an adulterer and a murderer. But finally, as a penitent one who confesses his sin. Then you have chapters 13 and 14, David as a father of a family in turmoil. Then you have 15 through 18, David as a refugee, fleeing from his own son who's trying to usurp the kingdom. And then 19 through 20, David as one who fights adversity. And finally, chapters 21 to 24, you have David in his role as an executioner, as a military leader, as a writer of songs, and as a census taker, and all of the mistakes that David made there. Now, that is the story, or the outline of the story of David's life as you find it in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So there's a lot of great preaching to be done. I wish we had time to talk about how you might go about doing that, but we've got to go on as we survey the preaching of the historical books. So let's go to the book of the Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings. This is, of course, the book that lays out after Saul and David and Solomon. Then there is a division of the kingdom after Solomon. But what we get in the first part of 1 Kings, chapters 1 through 11, is the great 40 years reign of King Solomon. So for 40 years, Solomon reigns, and we see all of that in chapters 1 through 11. Then, in the book of 1 Kings, chapters 12 through 22, we have the next 80 years, which is the reign of Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and the ministries of the prophets Elijah and Elisha. We have the reigns not only of Jeroboam and Rehoboam, but other kings of Judah and Israel that are listed during that time. This is what we learn. These are the stories that we get in the book of 1 Kings. So what you have in 1st and 2nd Kings, you have kind of three major acts here. In the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, they really cover a period of history from the reign of Solomon to the fall of Jerusalem. So you're looking at roughly 400 years here, 4 centuries of biblical history. You see it in three broad acts. Acts number 1 is the reign of Solomon in 1 Kings 1 through 11. Act number 2 is the story of the divided kingdoms and kings of Judah and the kings of Israel, 1 Kings 12 through 2 Kings 17. And then act number 3 is finally the account of the surviving southern kingdom of Judah from the time of Hezekiah toward the end of the 8th century until the time of Josiah and his sons in the 7th and the 6th centuries, finally ending with the destruction of Jerusalem and deportation of the exiles to Babylon in 586 BC. And all of that is found in 2 Kings 18 through 25. So the book of 2 Kings, from a structural standpoint, covers all of that material. So you get the northern kingdom is predominantly talked about in 1 through 9, alternating annals of the northern and southern kingdom in 1 through 10, alternating annals of both the southern and northern kingdoms, 11 through 17, and finally Judah, the southern kingdom only, in 18 to 25, and that is the structure of the book of 2 Kings. Now, again, this book has a lot of good preaching in it. You got the Elijah, and the Elisha narratives. You have the good kings of Judah and the bad kings of Judah, and the kings of the northern kingdom, Israel, were virtually all bad. You don't really have any good kings there. But there are many, many important lessons that we find, and so you want to be sure that you preach. Through 1st and 2nd Kings. All right, so we've seen 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Now let's talk about 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Now there's some overlap in the Kings and in the Chronicles, right? We see some overlap there. And the period of time that is covered in the Chronicles is basically the period of time stretches all the way. 1st Chronicles 1:1 talks about Adam. So all the way from the creation, the beginning of creation in Adam, all the way to 538 BC, when the decree of Cyrus allows the exiles to go back after they've been in exile for 70 years. And so the story is told genealogically in 1 Chronicles 1 through 9. You get some genealogy listed there. And then in 1 Chronicles 10, all the way to the end of 2 Chronicles, you get the narrative of these kings and what occurred during that time. So, the first book of Chronicles, the big picture structure that you need to know for preaching would be 1 through 9 goes together, and then 10 through 29 goes together. You've got the main genealogies of Israel in 1 through 9. This is not something you would want to preach several sermons on. You'd have to, again, go through, look at the big picture, but you have 4 segments of genealogies: Adam to Jacob in chapter 1, Jacob to David in chapter 2, David to King Zedekiah and the post-exile, chapter 3, and then the various tribe genealogies and allotments in chapters 4 through 8, and then finally the resettlement of the land post-exile, chapter 9. Now that is 1 Chronicles, first 9 chapters. Then, it's interestingly enough, 1 Chronicles deals with David's reign at Jerusalem from chapters 10 through chapters 29. And so now we're getting parallel accounts of David's life that we learned back in Samuel. And so we see David's anointing in chapters 10 through 12, David's work with the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark in 13 through 16, David's covenant, the covenant of the Lord with David, 17 through 21, and the temple of the Lord in 22 through 29. Finally, David's death recorded in 29 verses 26 through 30. Now, that is the book of Chronicles, 1 Chronicles. What about 2 Chronicles? All right, 2 Chronicles covers 2 major areas. The first 9 chapters go together, and then the last chapters 10 through 36 go together. You have Solomon's 40-year reign is again recorded in chapters 1 through 9. And then Judah's history, all the way to the exile, recorded in chapters 10 through the end of the book in chapter 36. And that's the situation in 2 Chronicles. Now, there are parallels between 1st and 2nd Chronicles. or between First and Second Chronicles there, and then the story of David and Solomon in the book of Kings, Samuel and Kings. And so it's very interesting to look at those parallels and see how they relate. There are things that are told about David in Chronicles that are not told about David in Samuel and Kings. And so these are important things to take note of. But as you look at First and Second Chronicles, the unifying idea of what's going on in these books is the prominence that is given to the temple, particularly in Second Chronicles. So J. Sidlow Baxter, in his book Explore the Book, which is an excellent work you need to have for your library. Some of the material that I'm using in this lecture right now actually comes from J. Sidlow Baxter's material on the historical books in his book entitled Explore the Book. Here's what he says as he describes these similarities and differences between Chronicles. The account of Solomon's reign is shorter here in the Chronicles than it is in First Kings. Yet no less than 6 out of the 9 chapters given to it in Second Chronicles refer more to the temple. So now the focus is on the temple. The same significance occurs in chapter 10, where we have the apostasy of the nation's worship, and as well as the house of David, but yet everything turns back to the temple. And then in the final chapters 10 through 36 of Second Chronicles, everything is about, or most everything is again about the temple. And so the Chronicles are written later than obviously Samuel and Kings, and now the focus is on what's happening in the role of the temple. And we see the difference between, as I've mentioned, David in First Chronicles, what is said about him, and material that occurs that does not occur in Samuel or in Kings. Again, there is much interesting similarities and differences when you look at what's happening with Chronicles. There's a lot of overlap, in other words, but yet there is some new material. Now, here's the bottom line as we close down talking about Chronicles. The book of Chronicles ends with the Davidic throne gone. Finally, everybody's gone into captivity. The northern kingdom is no more. The southern kingdom is destroyed. They go into exile. Finally, they return. We get the post-exilic books, which we're about to look at in just a moment, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, and the post-exilic prophets, which are the last 3 minor prophets in your Old Testament. But basically, Chronicles looks back at the past, then it looks forward to the future on that someone is going to reign on David's throne, but then it talks about the present time and that Yahweh is still with his people and that he has brought them back. He has not forgotten his people. He brings them back, and we see that those factors are going to be laid out in Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. All right? But nevertheless, these are all of the information related to and relationships of First and Second Chronicles to First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings. Now, how do these books relate to the final 3 books we want to talk about, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther? Here's how they relate. Chronicles is looking back predominantly. It's at the end of the exile, and it's looking back. And it tracks the kings and all of their evil deeds and how God judged the northern and finally the southern kingdom. But then we go to Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And whereas the book of First and Second Chronicles is retrospection, Ezra is restoration. God brings Ezra, and they bring a group back, and they begin to rebuild the temple. And then under Nehemiah, there is the reconstruction of the walls of the city. And finally, Esther, Queen Esther, becomes the key of the preservation of the people of Israel when the Persian king Xerxes was planning to wipe them completely out. So this is the connection between Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. So we come to preaching the book of Ezra, and basically the book of Ezra, you need to know, again, is divided into two major sections. Chapters 1 through 6 go together, the return of the exiles under Zerubbabel. Chapters 7 through 10 go together, the return under Ezra. So you've got two returns recorded in the book of Ezra, separated by a few years. The return under Zerubbabel, chapters 1 through 6, and everything that goes on, the return under Ezra, chapters 7 through 10. This is the book of the structure overall of the book of Ezra. Now, the key thing about the book of Ezra is the rebuilding of the temple, the place of worship. But when we now come to the book of Nehemiah, the key thing there is the rebuilding of the wall of Jerusalem and the reinstructing of the people in the ways of God. So again, we have a book, Nehemiah, with two major sections. You need to be aware of this in order to preach correctly what's going on in Nehemiah. Nehemiah 1 through 6 go together. This is the reconstruction of the wall. And you see how Nehemiah leads and all of the opposition and how opposition is overcome and how the rebuilding of the walls are completed in record time because of God's blessings. But then you've got the reinstruction of the people in chapters 7 through 13. And so we have the renewal of the law in the great section of Nehemiah chapter 8, the revival there at the water gate of Israel. And we have the preaching of the law. And that's a great chapter to preach from, by the way. It's the foundational chapter of the second section of the book of Nehemiah. And then you have the reconsecration of the people, the dedication of the walls, and we're going to deal with all of the abuses that are going on. And so finally, the book of Nehemiah concludes. Now, you may be aware that there have been books that have been written on Nehemiah. Now, not really commentaries. There are many commentaries on Nehemiah, but there are also books written from the perspective of leadership. Nehemiah is a popular Bible character in terms of a study in leadership. Chuck Swindoll wrote a great book that you must use if you're ever going to preach through the book of Nehemiah. Hand Me Another Brick. Don't miss Chuck Swindoll's book on leadership principles in the book of Nehemiah. Also, great preaching ideas in that book, and you want to go through there. Use those kind of books when you're preaching the book of Nehemiah. Also, let me suggest this in the book of Nehemiah. Don't miss the 6 prayers, the 6 brief prayers of Nehemiah. Here's a great devotional study if you'd like to use it sometime, or you could kind of create a more of a topical sermon just on this subject right here. But here they are in 5:19, talking about the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah prays, "Remember for my good, O my God, all that I have done for this people." Chapter 6, verse 14. "Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, O my God, and also Noadiah and the rest of the prophets who wanted to make me afraid." Chapter 13, verse 14. "Remember me, O my God, concerning this. Do not wipe out my good deeds." Chapter 13, verse 22, "Remember this also in my favor, O my God, and spare me." Chapter 13, verse 29, "Remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood." And finally, 13:31, "Remember me, O my God, for good." Now, this is a unique section. You don't really find this in any other book of the Bible that I'm aware of, but in 13 chapters, 6 times, Nehemiah offers brief prayers. 4 for himself, that God would remember him, and 2, that God would remember those those who are opposing his work, and would deal with them accordingly. So, preach the book of Nehemiah. Finally, we come to our survey of the book of Esther. What a great book Esther is. 10 chapters set during the Persian reign in the 5th century BC under King Ahasuerus, who is also known as Xerxes. And the book of Esther is the book of God's providential preservation of the people of Israel when they were facing annihilation. So God from the shadows. Interestingly enough, the book of Esther is the only book in the Old Testament where the name of God does not occur. But Esther is the book where the providence of God is more known, more seen than virtually any other book in all of the Old Testament. God is certainly on the scene. He's just behind the scenes. So the book of Esther can be divided into two major sections. You've got the crisis of chapters 1 through 5, where Queen Vashti is deposed, and chapter 1. Chapter 2, Esther becomes queen. Chapter 3, Haman decides to destroy the Jews. Chapter 4, Mordecai learns of the plot and pleads for help. Chapter 5, Esther determines how she will offer herself. If I perish, but I'm going to the king to try to stop that. So that's the first section of the book. The second section of the book is where God wins the victory, and the crisis that was anticipated and developed is now overruled by the providence of God. So in chapter 6, Mordecai is honored. In chapter 7, Haman is executed when he comes to Esther's feast. The Jews in chapter 8 are avenged and allowed to kill those that wanted to kill them. Chapter 9 is the institution of the Feast of Purim, which Israel still celebrates today. Chapter 10 is the finalization of the story where Mordecai is made the premier. Now that's a summary of the book of Esther. You've got to know that to preach through the book of Esther. You could easily do 10 sermons on the book of Esther, one per chapter, or you could combine some of that. Queen Vashti deposed, but Esther becomes queen. Maybe put 1 and 2 together. Haman's plot, but Mordecai is pleading for help. Put 3 and 4 together. Put Esther chapters 5 and 6 together as she conceives the plan to destroy Haman and so forth. But you could do 10 sermons, one per chapter, or you could do 5 sermons, putting 2 chapters together all of the way through the book of Esther. So this is the overarching structure of the book, and preaching through the book is something that at some point you definitely want to do. You do not want to miss the gems that are found in the book of Esther. Well, now there are lots of great tools that would be helpful to you in preaching through these books that we've talked about. Let me see if I can give you, of course, there are standard commentaries on Kings and Chronicles and all of that. We've mentioned some of the material on Ezra and on Nehemiah. But let me see if I can just give you some work on Esther, some suggested works on Esther. The Word Biblical Commentary by Frederick Bush is very good, all the detailed work on Esther. Joyce Baldwin's commentary on Esther in the Tyndale Old Testament series is also very good. Karen Jobes has a commentary on Esther in the New International, in the NIV Application Commentary series. Also, in the book of Esther, you could look, if you wanted to, at J. Vernon McGee's sermons, exposition of the book of Esther. You can read those from the 1951 edition. Might be helpful to you as well. And there are many other good works out there on Esther. Well, I hope that this has been helpful to you thinking about preaching, expository preaching in the Old Testament, and thinking about preaching the historical books of the Bible. So, thank you for being with us in this particular class, this particular lesson. I hope it's been good, and we'll look forward to our next time together.